Vanakkam, Namaskar and good evening. Welcome to Thunai webinar. I am Smita. The fifth in this series, we have with us Dr. Govind from University of Southern Queensland, Australia. Before I introduce Dr. Govind, our facilitator for this evening, I would like to share an excerpt of his co-authored book, Trauma-Informed Behavior Support. If we think of the baby's brain as a blank book, everything they experience is written into pages. Baby's relationship with the parent or carer is the author of the book. Over the years, as the baby grows, the experiences they have fill the chapters of this book and mold the person they will become, both socially and mentally. This is exactly what happens to us. Our early bonds with our mother or primary caregiver and the family environment shape our brain and our mental resilience in our adult life. Sometimes these early bonds could become a source of trauma that could keep us in a vulnerable state through our adult lives. These bonds could also become a source of strength for us for the rest of our lives. This is what this webinar is about: attachment bonds in our early life and how they shape our learning and our resilience in life. Dr. Govind Krishnamurthy is a clinical psychologist and lecturer at the University of Southern Queensland. He is based in Brisbane. Govind has extensive experience in the treatment of children and adolescents with a range of issues including anxiety, adjustment to life changes, mood, trauma, and behavioral problems. He is also trained in providing group programs including the Triple P, Circle of Security Parenting Program, the Incredible Years Program, Tuning into Kids and Tuning into Teens. We would like to hear more about all of these programs from him directly. His co-authored book with Dr. K. Ire, Trauma-Informed Behavior Support, is a free resource to support parents, therapists, and educators in helping children and adolescents. It brings a trauma and attachment lens to their behavior. Dr. Govind is also from Chennai and his parents still live there. Over to Dr. Govind.
And today we'll be talking about attachment. What is my experience with attachment? Like Smita was saying, I grew up in India and I came to Australia. It's been over 15 years actually, but I came to Australia to study psychology. And one of the first jobs I got was to work in a service that was for children who were in what we call child welfare or child protection. So these are children who've been exposed to abuse and neglect. Their parents haven't been able to take care of them properly. And it's been so severe that the state have had to intervene to remove the children. As you can imagine, I had to grow up very quickly, understand the true nature of the world and what it's actually like for some children, and how fortunate and grateful we should feel when with the kind of lives and childhoods that we've had. It was a real challenge to try and understand the unique experience that these children have had, to try to be able to have a scientific kind of understanding of it, a theoretical understanding of it, to be able to do research in it, and to be able to communicate it to other people who cannot even imagine the horrors that these children have been through. It was a real privilege and honor for me. I did that job for nearly a decade, and I'm very grateful for being witness to the struggles, but recovery, but incredible amount of courage that the children, and not just the children, the people around them have shown. And it's when you realize, when you work with these people to understand and help them, that you realize that we all benefit from it. We understand, we have insight into the true nature of what our lives are about. It kind of gives you perspective on what's important and what's not. But for me, it offered a real deep insight into what actually needs to happen to be able to help people. And I think one of the things that truly brings meaning and happiness. We all talk about happiness all the time, wanting to be happy. Meaning and happiness in our lives is our relationships. The quality of our relations by far is what dictates how content and happy and emotionally and mentally healthy we are. And a fundamental understanding of how relationships work well comes from attachment and attachment theory. So my hope today is to be able to communicate to you some of these ideas. My understanding is that there are people here who may be parents yourself. Welcome. If you've got adult children and you listen to what I'm saying today and you go, oh no, I should have done something different. I've made all these mistakes. Don't worry, you're not alone. And as I'll kind of talk to you, attachments are lifelong things. So you can always use these reflections on all your relationships in your life. If you are a health professional or a counselor, psychologist, I've included some information and practical kind of tools there for you to be able to use and take away. And if you're a researcher and scientist, I will share with you a little bit about the work we're doing and the book we've written and how we're utilizing that in schools and other forums as well, and raising awareness about mental health, even in very, very little people, and how important it is that we make those investments really early in life to ensure good outcomes. So that's going to be me. I'm just going to share my screen in just a minute. Okay, all right. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me okay. People tell me I don't have much of an accent, but I think I probably do. And being a psychologist, we like using a lot of jargon and big words. So I try not to do that. But if I do, please do keep me honest. Stop and ask me what I've just said. And I'm happy to kind of explain what we've just done. So that's me. I think I've talked about myself enough. I just wanted to start by acknowledging the lived experience of those impacted by traumatic events. And trauma is quite a broad spectrum of things. It could be grief and loss. It can be, things that you've kind of missed that are very dear to you, and also things that have been really frightening. And as I said from my previous roles, the people, the survivors, and I don't say victims, I say survivors of these sort of events show enormous amount of courage and have lots of lessons for us, but equally important are the people around them. So some of what I'm talking about today might be upsetting for you to hear. It might remind you of things in your family, of people who have crossed your path, or it might even remind you of perhaps of clients and families you've worked with that perhaps you didn't help as much. So if you feel distressed at any point, please feel free to take a break. If you want to reach out to me after the lecture to talk about anything, I'm happy to talk to you as well. It's natural for us to react strongly to some of this material. It hits very closely at some of how we feel, some of the kind of painful parts of our lives. So please feel free to take care of yourself, step out, or reach out to me if you need to. That's the overview of today. So I've kept it pretty simple. We'll go for about an hour. Like Smitha said, please type in your comments in the chat. Someone just said I don't have much of an accent. I'm very proud of that, actually, after all this time. So thank you for that. But please do type it. I'll stop periodically and check those comments. And I'm happy to have a chat with anyone who wants to unmute and talk as well. So we'll talk about the impact of trauma and disrupted attachment. So what does it look like when attachment and relationship forms well? What is attachment? What does good attachment look like? But also I want to leave you with a bit of a framework to think about some practices that you can use to build trust and relationships and what we call relational safety. A few learning objectives as well. I like this quote, and it's from Daniel Stan, who is an academic who's done a lot of work, researcher in the area of infant mental health. That's the emotional well-being of infants as soon as they're born. Some people might be hearing this going, well, emotional well-being? of infants. I didn't know they had kind of rich emotional lives. Well, it turns out they do. It's not just crying and wanting to be fed and having the nappies changed, that they start to have very sophisticated emotional lives, and have sophisticated responses to their environments as soon as they're born. And how we understand infants has changed a lot. Technology has come along, which means we can understand the brain in real time. We have more sophisticated ways of being able to observe behavior, record behavior, analyze behavior as well. So our theories about how attachment forms and what infant needs has also changed. Believe it or not, children and infants are not little adults. They're not immature adults. And that sounds strange to say, but it wasn't even 100 years ago that we used to think that they were just miniature adults that needed adult things provided to them early on. And it's amazing how those not prejudicial, I think those misunderstandings about what children need continue to perpetuate in our society today. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. I wanted to start by showing you a video, and I'm just going to do that by stopping my share and sharing a different screen with you. So just give me a minute. Okay, so this video I'm about to share, it's from YouTube. I think what it really nicely does is it covers the work of one of my heroes, John Bowlby, and how he came to understand attachment, and a lot of his attachment theories are still relevant today. I think it makes links to some of the primatology, animal-based research that kind of forms the basis of attachment, and it gives you a little glimpse of the kind of work we're doing at the moment to understand that parent-child relationship. So I'll just share this. Hopefully you can all see that. Or if you can't hear it, please let me know.
John Bowlby was a British psychologist, and he became extremely interested
We can hear it.
in child-mother separation during the bombing of London. Bombing of London, a lot of parents sent their kids to the safety of the countryside. And the kids were with safe people. They were well cared for. They were well fed. But they still had a very negative response to the separation from their mothers. At that point, he looked at the biology that was emerging in primatology. A monkey infant gets almost all its nutrition in the first 2 or 3 months of life from its mother, from lactation. But the infant who's weaned still seeks proximity. You'll see the infant reach out and touch the mom's tail or touch its coat. There's a continuing lifelong desire for proximity and contact. And Bowlby and others have seen that proximity seeking and that contact seeking as being cornerstones of what they call attachment behavior.
In the first part of the 20th century, behaviorists and psychoanalysts claimed that babies love their parents because you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. The innovation of Bowlby was to observe that that can't be all, that what the child needs is not only to be fed, but also to be held by an understanding, sensitive, and responsive adult, and that optimal social mental health outcomes will follow from that. 60 or more years on now, we have a half century of evidence showing that he was more or less right.
Our program at the Center for Babies, Toddlers, and Families is really based on the theories of John Bowlby, with the idea that we really need to help parents and children form a secure attachment. So oftentimes families are referred to us when the parents have had very difficult childhoods themselves and are really struggling in this role of being a parent.
Like I said, I never had a mommy. I was never taught how to take care of anybody or myself. So it was like very hard. Like I wouldn't have patience, like the crying, like I would, scream at her and stuff like that, and
for many parents who really were neglected as children, hearing a baby cry triggers in them their own feelings of that unrelenting crying that they did. So for Pearl, it was very, very difficult for her to be able to meet her child's needs.
Push this button. Yeah, hard, push it.
We've partnered with the Center for Attachment Research at the new school for a series of attachment measures to test that our intervention is effective.
Morning, Pearl. Ask her chair. So just put her down and let her have a go at whatever she wants to do in here. Okay. We measure the attachment relationship with a laboratory scenario that takes 20 minutes. The critical point is where the mother gets a cue to leave the room.
Bye, baby girl.
Some children look on the outside like they're very independent and seem not to notice, but physiologically are very aroused and stay aroused even in the presence of when a caregiver returns. By contrast, the securely attached child often notices, cries when the caregiver leaves. When the caregiver comes back, easily turns to the caregiver and looks at the caregiver to be comforted, and then they can get back to some kind of homeostasis. We think this response is one of the hallmarks of mental health.
What is so interesting about childhood development is that we know a lot about the long-term, lifelong consequences of early life adversity, ranging from psychological effects like substance abuse and depression, but also biological consequences like increased incidence of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and a whole host of other physical ailments. One of the things we know that can lead down the path towards cardiovascular disease is chronic inflammation. Inflammation is a biological response that helps the body counteract an infection. The body produces chemicals which activate the immune system and allow it to get rid of the infective agent. When the infection is contained, the body calls forth cortisol to try to turn down the inflammation. Now, this is all good, but there are situations, especially connected with traumatic experiences, in which that cortisol response doesn't happen. So these people who had these adverse early life experiences had elevated levels of inflammation, which is at the heart of cardiovascular disease. So cortisol is very important.
That's my point.
The way that we measure cortisol is through a saliva sample obtained upon arrival at the lab and at the end of the lab visit. And our goal is to, over time, impact patterns of cortisol. At our initial measurements of these families when they were beginning the intervention, we see very low levels of attachment security as measured by their behavior. But when we look at families who have participated for 6 months or more, we see attachment security at 70%, the same levels seen worldwide. Because higher levels of attachment security correlate with more normal cortisol responses. We're hoping to see their cortisol levels change as a result of the intervention.
The main thing was, it helped me a lot to focus on my child. Like before I couldn't tolerate the crying and it would make me crazy and I used to be depressed. But now, sometimes I can't take it, but I know better now.
What have we learned from the studies of early life adversity? What we've learned is to take it seriously, that these are real biological issues. That early attachment is vital to everything else that happens. Something that is an inevitable part of who we are as human beings.
Hey, just come back. Full screen. Hey, all right. Well, I hope you found that interesting. What we'll do for the rest of the talk is actually review some of the ideas and concepts that are introduced in the video. It's actually quite a dense video. There are lots of concepts and ideas there, and part of what we'll try and do now is to try and unpack a little bit of some of what has been talked about, and think about what implications that has for us. So a couple of comments about the biological aspects of it. We'll talk a little bit more about the biology and brain development and general health. We know a lot more about how mental health and emotional health impacts physical health now, and the interventions as well. People are mentioning about the transition of attachment becoming healthy. So attachment is not fixed, we can intervene with it. And then the earlier we can do that, the more amenable it is to intervention and change. And so the first thing to kind of understand is this idea of early brain development, really, that we haven't finished developing, that there are, in a particular time frame, that it actually, that there is a sequence that follows, and it's not just in terms of physical growth, but it's also in mental growth and emotional growth. And what we find here, this is very interesting, you start to see that a lot of the development starts to be really rapid around the 3-year mark. You can see they're all kind of peaking in that 3-year mark kind of phase. And this is what a lot of policy and public policy and advocacy has been about, in terms of what we talk about as the first 1,000 days, the first 3 years, and how vital it is for young children and their development. Sorry, I've just got an insect in my room. I'm just going to deal with that. There we go. That's what Australia is famous for, insects. They're not usually in my room, but here you go. Oh, here. Here we go. Get rid of him. Sorry about that. So the first 1,000 days. So it's really critical. And if you think about little children, and if you think about how they learn through relationships. If you notice the way that mom was on the ground playing with her, that dad was kind of, blowing raspberries on the little child, the children learn in the context of relationships. It's what we call a serve and return relationship. So this idea that they give you cues, you look at them, you kind of try and figure out what they're doing, and you give it back to them. And it is from that serve and return, in the context of that relationship, that the babies and little children learn. So a lot of those first 1,000 days, there's a lot of advocacy around parental leave for parents to actually be there to support them in that peak kind of window, sensitive kind of window of time, that they're kind of developing all these things, and that we also encourage that environments that the child's going in the first 3 years are safe and caring and responsive, and stimulating, that they're in environments that are stimulating as well. So those kind of windows, sensitive windows, we have them in a few places through the brain development, through kind of childhood. We have that in the 0 to 3. We have that in that kind of 5-year mark where the kids are starting school as well. And then we see a sensitive period, a pruning period in sort of early adolescence. And essentially what we see there is that the brain starts to stop sort of growing in adolescence, starting to become more efficient and laying down kind of pathways to improve kind of decision making and that kind of thing. So we have a hand up, so we'll just take that question.
It's Venkat Ram. Yeah, can you please unmute your mic?
I think he's having some trouble. I don't know if, oh, yep. No?
All right. Dr. Govind, meanwhile, we have a question.
Yeah.
Sensitive means most receptive to information growth. That's a question. What do you mean by sensitive?
Yeah, by sensitive, we mean two things. One is that it's a phase of like rapid development. So the brain is growing very quickly, but with that growth, the brain is most sort of responsive to the environment it is in. So if there's any time in which the child is more affected by the environments they're in, it's in that 0 to 3 kind of phase. So they are influenced, they're impacted by those environments because the brain is developing and it's developing in response to the environments it's in. So I hope that makes sense. Great. All right. So we'll keep going. So of course, in the video, they talk about attachment. And attachment is that emotional bond between the infant, a young child, and the caregiver who's responsible for comforting them, nurturing them, protecting the child. So like they were saying in the video, we used to think, of course, children love their parents because they're the ones who feed them. They're the ones who take care of them, a bit like a puppy loves their owner. But what we in fact know that it's not just about protection, it's actually much deeper than that kind of love and connection and touch. It performs lots of very important functions that influences development, influences growth, and influences learning in those early stages of life. And we see kind of real biological kind of differences between children who have received nurturing, receptive kind of environments and those who haven't. And one of the very stark ways in which we see that is in the attachment or emotional relationship that the child shares with the parent. What we think about attachment as well is also attachment as a behavior. So in the video, you might have noticed, the work with monkeys that they were doing very early on, where the child monkey was trying to get close to the mom, not just for the milk, but also for comfort. And there are lots of famous studies. If you're a psychology major watching this, you know all about Harry Harlow and the monkeys and the wire monkeys, where they realized that the little monkeys weren't just attaching to mums because of the provision of milk. They were attaching for comfort, for that feeling of fur, for kind of intimacy as well. So what we find that attachment is a verb as well. It's that instinctive tendency to seek safety in proximity, the specific figure or set of figures when feelings of threat or vulnerability are triggered. So it serves a very, very important evolutionary function. We're a social animal. One of the ways we've been able to survive is being able to be and thrive in packs, in groups. And what kind of keeps us in groups or ties us within groups is not just, sharing the same blood and that kind of thing or looking similar. It's actually this emotional connection that serves a very important purpose. So I'll talk about attachment theory now, and of course John Bowlby is a key figure in that. it's many decades of work is what we're talking about, and I wanted to do a fair shout out to all those people. Attachment theory has moved on from Bowlby. There's a lot more contemporary science, a bit like what you watched in there around developmental psychology and psychopathology, but a lot of those kind of core ideas still remain. One of the things that we know that's very important for attachment and early development is this idea of safety. So this idea of feeling safe is a very important concept. What is safety for a child who cannot speak, who doesn't have abstract thought? Can they actually feel safety? And turns out they do. They can't think of safety, but they feel safety. And one of the ways that we know that they feel safety is through the biological hormonal processes that happen within the child. So if you notice in the video, they were taking these mouth swabs of cortisol and things like that. Now, cortisol is a stress hormone. It's a very good indicator of physiological arousal. You can get it from saliva, you can get it from hair follicles, but daytime saliva stuff is probably the most accurate. And what it's kind of telling us is, even though we might not appear stressed, our physiology might be at high stress. And what we see that even in very young infants, very small babies, that there are differences in cortisol levels. And in fact, in babies who are in environments where there might be a lot of violence, a lot of kind of abuse, a lot of yelling, deprivation, and things like that, what we start to see is they experience cortisol burnout. So they're so physiologically aroused that their cortisol levels are running on high all the time. So this child might not completely cognitively understand what's happening, but they are experiencing biologically and physiologically this feeling of threat. And that, it's quite profound, really, because we're so well engineered to survive that even before we can think, we can respond, that these feelings kind of are emerging. Now, this is all very new. I remember even 20 years ago in child protection, people used to say, don't worry, the child was in the other room, and they didn't really hear about it, but we moved them away to another place. But what we know is that even little babies in those environments are impacted, their attachments impacted, their biology is impacted, if they don't have that feeling of safety within themselves, in their environment, and within the relationships they're in. What we know about, feelings of safety and secure attachments and that kind of good connection is that it's just as much about the child as it is about the parent. So it's both the parent and the child that make up good attachment. So when we think about the child, if anyone here who is who's got children, you know that, and if you've got a couple, each one has a different personality, not just ones that sleep better. Each of them have a different temperament. Some are more chilled out, other ones are more kind of temperamental and grumpy, and that might carry on for the rest of their life. And also what we find is sometimes those emotional needs might be very different. If they've got developmental difficulties, if they've got developmental concerns like autism or medical concerns, all of a sudden the child's emotional needs start to become different. And that can be really demanding on the parent. So you might have a parent who's secure, who's had a good kind of upbringing, but all of a sudden you're placed with a child with an extraordinary amount of need of particular types of kind of emotional requirements that might really push you in terms of what you can provide. And equally, what we find is that it's just as much about the parent as well. So in the video, they talk about, for parents who haven't had good childhoods themselves, this idea of hearing a child cry is very distressing for them, because it reminds them of how difficult their upbringing might have been. Equally, depending on how how the pregnancy happened, it could be a very traumatic pregnancy, which means the mom and the dad might be still reeling from it, all from having just almost died from the procedure. And the other thing to remember as well is that that when a baby is born, that not all mothers automatically have this gushing, loving response to the child. It's not like the thing that we see on TV. Your eyes don't always glow up. In fact, a lot of the time you're tired, you're exhausted, you're weary. It's really hard to take things in. So many parents will say it's really hard to have kind of clear memories of what it was like when the child was really young. I know that's true for me. We were just getting through each day. To have my daughter sleep through the night and make sure she's fed. And it's important to challenge these ideas of falling in love with your baby right away, because a lot of mothers don't, and there's a lot of shame and guilt associated with that as well. And of course, a combination of both of those leads to things like postnatal depression, which is extraordinarily common, and we're understanding more about. So the important thing about attachment is that it's not about blaming the parents, and it's not about persecuting the child. That attachment is just as much about the child as it is about the parent, and that being able to understand the dynamic and needs of both of those people is the heart of what we call healthy infant mental health. So infant mental health, when we think about infant mental health, we have these funny images of like a little baby on a couch and someone writing notes and what possible mental health can they have. What we're actually talking about is the quality of emotional life, the physiological stress, and how that can be mediated in that relationships. And we need to have an understanding of both the child and the parent and the relationship to be able to facilitate that well. So what we know about healthy attachment is that there are some very predictable things that a carer does and the caring environment it provides for them that promotes a secure attachment. And I'll talk to you about this in a little while. But what we also know that these sort of the need for attachment is kind of consistent across cultures. One of the terrible things in psychology is a lot of our research actually happens in these sort of industrialized societies where, where there's funding for this sort of research, really, to be honest. And so a lot of our generalizations become very specific to certain groups of people or certain types of relationships. But what we know about attachment patterns, that need for attachment, that secure attachment is found across cultures. And what we find is approximately anywhere between 60 to 70% of people are securely attached. So most parents get it right. And not just right, they get it what Bowlby calls Winnicott calls good enough. So having a good enough attachment is being responsive to your kind of baby about 30 to 40% of the time. Now that's a huge relief for me. I often find that being a psychologist myself, where I'm really critical of the kind of things I do and I'm reflective and putting myself down. But what I always remember is I just need to get it 30 to 40% right. If I get it right more often than times, I'm not giving enough of an opportunity for my child to, have ruptures with me and make repairs and learn about conflict and disagreement and anger and things like that. And if I'm getting it less than that, that means I'm more preoccupied and I need to change my lifestyle to be able to provide. So that 30% good enough parenting is what we're all kind of aiming for. And that's what we're aiming for most people as well. And so we see that across cultural differences. One of the things we do know with collectivist cultures, like, I grew up in India, so, this idea that, there's an emphasis on family, on the greater good, on the community and things like that, is we kind of find that there might be a number of what we call attachment figures. So it might not just be mom and dad, there might be a number of people. But what we find is there is a consistency in who those primary caregivers are. So there's often one or two people that you go to for most of your emotional needs. And you might go to an uncle, maybe like an auntie or cousin or whoever for different things, but there's usually one primary person who you go to. So for example, example, my mother, she didn't necessarily grow up with her parents. She grew up with her grandmother, my great-grandmother, and so, technically her attachment figures were parents, but really, truly, her attachment figures were really with her grandmother, who was consistently there, who used to go back to, she used to go back to over time. And we see that in collectivist cultures, we see that in our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here, our Indigenous people, we see that there. It's a very old and collectivist culture there. So there's lots of kind of agreement across cultures. So let's talk a little bit about the brain development. One of the most fascinating studies, I think, around brain development that's happened more recently is this idea of what we call mirror neurons. I don't know if people have been exposed to this idea. It's where we turn on these machines called fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and what we see is that we can see kind of brain activity changing in real time. In one person when they're exposed to different sort of stimulus, but we can also see it amongst kind of two people. And one of the things that we see in parent-child kind of relationships is that the patterns of activation in the parent mirror the activation in the child and vice versa, right? So what we're starting to see is that the patterns in which, if a child's going, opening the eyes and making a sound, and we're looking them in the eye and, mirroring what they're doing, we start to see the serve and return, not just behaviorally, but we're actually seeing it neurologically. So you can imagine how a sensitive caregiver is so important in shaping how that brain is activated and develops. And what we actually know is that that kind of mirroring happens in a lot of our kind of relationships, even across time, close relationships across time. So when you see a group of people sitting together laughing, if you put an fMRI on a lot of them, you'll see similar kind of activation of patterns, because you're all kind of sharing what we call an intersubjective experience, that you're both paying attention to each other, that you're all attending to one thing, and that the activation is the same. Now, this is quite a revelation for us, particularly in individualistic cultures where you think, everyone is their own island. But what it's kind of really shaping our idea is this idea of an extended mind, that we are not living and growing in isolation, that our environments, our relationships particularly, are influencing us. Now, if you think about this, as a secure relationships, you can see that would be healthy. If you have a parent or a caregiver who is having mental health concerns, who's frightened all the time, who's angry all the time, some of those emotions gets mirrored in the child as well. A really angry, disgruntled kind of parent kind of, might mirror similar sort of patterns in the child, which we know is stressful and is not kind of conducive for healthy developmental growth. So some of this happens in most relationships. I know I get angry with my daughter. I think it happened today when she did something and I said no to her. And I'm sure there's a part of her brain that lit up and wasn't, was kind of processing the fact that Appa wasn't happy. But when you have sort of children who are perpetually exposed to that, who are kind of exposed to that a lot for whatever reason, because of the parent or the child, or they're, going through really difficult medical kind of things where they're under a lot of stress, they start to experience what we call toxic stress. When they experience toxic stress, is their stress response is constantly going off. I think of it as like a fire alarm that's constantly kind of beeping all the time. And what we know is that's not healthy for brain development. It makes them feel unsafe. It kicks off what we call the fight, flight, or freeze response, and it leads to things like behavioral problems. It leads to learning difficulties, and lots of those things sort of down the track. And of course, it also shapes the way that they manage their behaviors. So mirror neurons, the mirror neuron effect is incredibly powerful and useful to understand, and it also kind of gives us an insight into why relationships are important, but also what impact they have on development. So one of the things that we have learned across time and it is that, depending on those early kind of years, that different people have different styles in which they conduct themselves in relationships. Now, if you're sitting here listening to this, I'm sure you've all know people who've got different personalities. Some people who are really kind of quick to temper and anger, other people who don't trust anybody anytime. They're really watchful, other people who are overly trustful. So everyone's got a different kind of take on relationships, but what we know is that there are some predictable behavioral patterns that we sort of notice across people. The one that we want for most people is the secure attachment that's on the top left. It's when the caregiver is sensitive, the child kind of thinks this is good, I can go to mum for help, I can ask Appa, my dad will be there if I get hurt and things like that. And with secure attachments, there are two important functions that we find that most caregivers do. One is what we call a secure base, and the other is what we call a safe haven. A secure base, and I think of it as the two hands of someone who holds a child. A secure base is being the place that the child can return to after they have explored the environment that they're in. So if you think about it for yourself, we all have a secure base. I know I was well into my 20s or whatever when I would still pick up the phone and call my parents because I was worried about something and whatnot. So they are my secure base. So even though I was miles away from them, I used to keep going back to them because I knew they could help me, they could support me in different ways, just by talking through a problem or helping me, when I'm down, or providing for me in some way. So that sort of secure base is really, really important. And what we know sometimes is that depending on, what's happening for the adult, they can't always be that secure base for the child. The other really important thing is this safe haven. So safe haven is moving away from those practical problem-solving things to actually thinking about emotional things. Are you that person that the child can come to when they're upset? If they're upset, are you sort of inviting them in, talking about what's wrong? Are you offering comfort? Or are you saying to them, stop crying, there's no need to cry, what are you doing this for? Go off, you'll be okay, you'll be fine. If you're constantly dismissing like that, you're no longer the safe haven. Now, of course, we don't want to be too much of the secure base because then the children will never leave home. They'll never solve a problem. They won't go to school. They'll constantly rely on us to do everything for them. So we need to do a little bit of that, but be able to encourage them to do that on their own. And we don't want to be too much of a safe haven either. We want children to what we call self-regulate. They need to find a way to be able to manage their own feelings, but we do it enough that we can provide them support and co-regulate them when they need it. So when you can provide a secure base and a safe haven consistently, that's when we find that children are secure. And of course, with the good enough parenting, you want to try and get that right about 30% of the time, and that your kind of environments are safe as well. What we then find is a number of ways in which the children, but also adults down the track, develop insecure attachments. And there's a few different varieties of that. The first one is what we call resistant, or another word for it is anxious ambivalent. Now, anxious ambivalent attachments often result from when parents are often intrusive. They have intense expressions of they're inconsistent, so the child never knows if they're there or if they're not there, if they're going to help them or not help them, if they're going to be upset or they're going to be happy to hear their problems. So the child is always left kind of guessing about what's going to happen. And so what happens is that the child wants to have, what they want is predictability. They want some way in which they can have the parent and carer predictably respond to their needs. That's what we all want, isn't it? We want a salary so it pays us consistently so we can pay off a mortgage or hold up a lifestyle. We all want predictability. And so if you have a parent who doesn't provide that consistent response, you start engaging in behaviors that creates predictable responses to you. So often these children will have intense expressions of distress. They'll kind of, get really, really upset. And when the parent comes in to comfort them, which they know will happen reliably, often it's ineffective because the child, doesn't want to accept the kind of comfort because they don't really know when they're going to get it. So if I make myself dependent on this comfort, then I'm putting myself in a really tough spot because I don't think you're very dependable and reliable. But when I kind of get really upset, you seem to come close, which offers me some comfort to a certain point, but it takes me a lot longer to calm down with the kind of help that you're kind of giving me. So there's a constant sort of coming and going that happens with anxious ambivalent attachment. And what we start to see into adulthood is in kind of relationships, what we find is that these are the people who often have a lot of trouble with, being able to be consistently available for their partner, but also that they think that the only way in which their needs can be met is by really, having a big meltdown, a big crisis or whatnot. Put up that post on Facebook where everyone's writing in sympathy comments about how hard it is for you, and if they start to believe that that's the only way in which they can get their needs met. Of course, the other kind of form of attachment is what we call avoidant attachment. And these are kind of often children who see adults as people who have hurt them intensely, and that, there is no positives to actually engaging in a relationship. So all human relationships seem to be a source of pain. They're a burden, they're a pain. If you let yourself be vulnerable, if you ask for help, people almost always let you down. And so the best strategy, the predictable strategy is to just rely on your own and shut everyone else out. And so be independent. Of course, what we know about that strategy is that it's not sustainable. We all have physiological stress, we all have emotions, and often, shutting people out and not relying on yourself isn't the best strategy. And when we don't have people to be able to help us with our feelings, we resort to other things like drinking or smoking or taking painkillers or getting addicted to, the internet or whatever it is. So we find other anxiolytics to kind of replace what needs to happen within relationships. The final one is disorganized. I'll just explain this and then I'll hop onto some questions in a second. So disorganized attachment is when it's not just that the parent is not consistent, it's not just that they've said a couple of mean things to them and that they haven't, that they've shamed them, punished them, and they've hurt them. So it's not avoidant and it's not inconsistent. Disorganized is when the parent or caregiver actually becomes frightening. So the person you love is also the thing that you are most frightened about. So the person you love is also the thing that you're most frightened about. So can you imagine what an incredible dilemma that is? So in one hand, you want to be close to them, but the other hand, everything about you is terrified about this person hurting you in a really frightening kind of way. And this is when the children don't really have a predictable strategy. At least with avoidant, they say, I'll have some predictability if I shut everyone out. At least with anxious ambivalent, they say, if I really express big emotions, I'll have proximity. Might not have comfort, but I'll have some proximity. With disorganized, they really bounce between avoidant and anxious ambivalent. So they go through back and forth. They don't have a coherent strategy. They're paranoid about abandonment. They feel like they can't trust anybody. People are going to leave them. They're definitely going to hurt them. And so what we find with disorganized attachments is that they have an extraordinary amount of difficulties sustaining relationships. They bounce from one relationship to another. They have a lot of what we call cutoffs. So they'll cut people off out of their life and you'll never see them again. It's very hard to kind of forgive people and make repairs. They're very emotionally labile. They're very, very emotional all the time. And so what we see is that when these people become parents, having a child is extraordinarily difficult because they have become what they were really frightened of. You know, this parent that they were really scared of, all of a sudden they are that person. You know, and if they're kind of meeting the needs of their child in some sort of healthy sort of way, they're very much reminded of how that's not done for them. And that's not about being selfish. It's something that they can't really help. It kind of brings up all these really difficult feelings and it becomes more complex for them. So what we know is that we can be able to spot these different patterns of attachment as early as the age of 3. So if you looked in that video, they were doing a little scientific process called a strange situation, where, you know, they'll sit the baby and mom in a room. There'll be a one-way mirror, or someone like me with a notepad or a computer on the other side, and then the mom leaves, and then they see what the child is like, and then the mom comes back and they see what the reunion is like after that. And just on those two interactions, we're able to kind of code what type of attachment that the child has. And what we find with securely attached is that the child gets really worried, it starts to cry, it goes, "Where's mom?" Mom comes back, she goes, "Oh, there you are," and then comes back and seeks comfort from mom. What we see in anxious ambivalent or resistant attachment is that the mom leaves, the child looks around, starts to sort of cry, the mom comes back, the child is still crying, mom's trying to comfort the child's still crying, they might even kind of walk away and still keep crying. Mom might try to comfort them again, they might get angry with them, you know, "Stop coming near me," they might be hitting and things like that because they're frustrated that that's not consistent. So that's what we start to see in a lot of the anxious resistant. With avoidant, which often is the saddest really, well, I think disorganized is the saddest, but avoidant, you know, the child will sort of be playing, the mom will leave, and the child won't even notice that the mom is gone. So it'll just keep, you know, the child will keep playing, the mom will come back, "Hello, little Johnny," you know, he might kind of look, but he might just keep doing his own thing anyway. So there's this real kind of disconnection between mom and the child. And of course, with disorganization, what we might see is that the child might come, they might get scared, they might like push mom away and then run away and then cry again. And mom might come, they might have a cuddle, she might push them away again. So it's really disorganized. And so the child is really frightened. It's living in this really unpredictable kind of world. So what that's telling us quite reliably is in that very early kind of stages, by watching behaviors, we can start to understand these patterns that are emerging, that are lifelong across the lifespan, and we can intervene and make a change very early on. So that, you know, when we think about those sensitive periods of brain development, you know, that is the place to intervene. So if we can intervene, change mom's behavior, you know, work on the relationship, then we can make a change in the attachment style. So I've got a couple of more things to say about the attachment styles, but I'll just see what questions we've got. Is that why some, Purva's asking, is that why some children grow up and become perpetrators as well? Because of the mirror neurons and the abuse they went through as kids. So it's a slightly complicated question that you're asking there, Purva. As with most things, there's never a straightforward answer. Let me say this. So one of the things we're starting to understand more and more about people who engage in conduct and criminal behavior is that we used to think that they were really high on personality traits like psychopathy. So these are people who were born to be criminals. They were always going to engage in this sort of behavior. There's some sort of personality defect that has made them go down this path. And that's probably what explains their behavior the most. What we're starting to understand is, yes, there is some genetic loading, there are some personality factors, but a lot of the time, these the people who are in sort of these, you know, juvenile detention or incarceration systems or jail, is that they often have a past childhood where they've experienced an extraordinary amount of trauma or disadvantage or deprivation of some form. So even though they might not exactly do what they were exposed to, what we know is that they've had a really prejudicial upbringing, and that they have that kind of disorganized attachment, and they have continued to live in environments that haven't given them a chance to correct or meet those needs. So it's not just enough just to have those prejudicial kind of early years, that they've also continued to live in environments that has forced them to engage in these sort of behaviors. So this is a very important concept to understand, because it's very easy for people to kind of think of some children as damaged, as they've had a terrible upbringing. There's nothing you can do to actually change or make a difference. They're going to end up being a psychopath. And what we know from research is that there is no evidence for that. There is no such thing as what we call a point of no return. So there's no such thing as someone not being being able to reap the benefits of therapeutic intervention. What we do know is that therapeutic interventions, the return on investment, so what we put in, becomes less and less across time. So if you invest in therapy earlier on, you're going to get more in terms of change. So that's why we talk about early intervention. Having said all of that, what we know is that there are a lot of people who have been exposed to a lot of abuse and maltreatment as childhood who don't end up being criminals and perpetrators of abuse. That's very important to understand. What is it about the person who's experienced a difficult childhood and ends up doing reasonably well in their life compared to someone who hasn't? And the best explanations for that is the environments that they're in, but most importantly, the relationships that they have. So one of the studies, the adverse childhood studies we found is, they tracked kind of people across time, and, comparing people who have kind of been incarcerated or put in jail compared to people who've had meaningful roles in the community. One of the big differences is that they have kind of what they call attachment relationships. That is someone that they were emotionally connected to and continue to have contact between 1 to 3 years. So someone who's been in their life between 1 to 3 years is enough to change the trajectory of someone who's headed down the wrong path to someone who can kind of hold it together, have meaningful relationships in their life. And I think that's the power of attachment. And that's something I tell myself when I'm having a really bad session, and the child and parent who want to have nothing to kind of do with what I'm kind of asking them to do, and I think the fact that I've continued to be a presence in their life, that they've come back to kind of see me, that I've been some form of secure base, is really important. And for those of you doing any sort of work, that sort of presence makes a powerful kind of impact. Getting it 30 to 40% right is promising for new parents. Is this really in their control, or do they need to work on their mental health? Is this teachable? Let's take it one by one. It is great, 30 to 40%. I know it was a relief for me, the good enough parenting. It is within their control. And so one of the things we do work really hard is to provide parents with information, not just about physical health, but about emotional health. What makes for stimulating, safe environments? We assume a lot of the time when that parent is taking them home that somehow they're all going to a home environment that's the same. This is false. We need to be able to empower and educate just as much as we do prenatal classes and things like that. We need to talk about things like attachment to them. There are some very predictable things like the secure base safe haven. What does that actually look like? Those sort of things the parents can do. We have solid research evidence around the kind of support and practices that makes for secure attachments and positive mental health. I think it is teachable. I think it becomes more complex the more difficulties and complexities there are with the families. Like I said, there might be physical health issues, there might be, family conflict, there might be substance use, there might be poverty. There's a lot of kind of issues there. But what we know is that having a conversation, teaching these skills, thinking about how we can implement those skills is a very important part of protecting that kind of infant mental health. Take the next one, Venkata Krishnan. If all moms come under any one of the attachment styles, I presume, which one is close to giving a traumatic experience to a child? Is it true? Okay, so I think what you're asking there, Venkata Krishnan, is which one is more likely to kind of be traumatic. So what we know is that a disorganized attachment, so let me answer it in a couple of ways. So a parent with a disorganized attachment style is the least likely to provide a safe and predictable living environment. So they'll find it most challenging. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't. What it means that they will find it the most difficult, and it'll be most difficult for them to not be frightening to that child. And we know this quite consistently. There's actually quite a big body of literature to say that disorganized attachment gets passed down intergenerationally. But what we also know is that appropriate intervention can make a difference to offset some of those things. A little comment about Charlie Chaplin. I think a lot of really successful people in the world have had really difficult times as children. I think this drive to secure some sort of validation from the world to achieve great things and to find meaning of that comes fundamentally from some sort of unmet need in relationships, but that has kind of morphed into social justice or valued sort of behavior into adulthood. So definitely, I think and it's often the most instructional, I think, listening and reading about these people, we learn a lot about recovery, about making meaning of our own lives. Does an aggressive child behavior always indicate anxiety and resistant attachment? No, thank you for that question. So what we know about child behavior is that it's both kind of simple and complex at the same time. So when people come to me, they're often worried about their son's behavior, they're worried about their daughter's mood, they're worried about their learning difficulties. And part of my job is to actually figure out why this is happening. So one of the ways I think about is the framework I use called biopsychosocial. So what are the biological factors, what are the psychological factors, what are the social factors, and the attachment sits in these social factors. So it's one explanation of a myriad of explanations about why the person's having difficulties. Now, let me just clarify attachment style. Attachment style is not a diagnosis. It's not like, diagnosing someone with post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or things like that. Attachment style is not a diagnosis. Attachment style can be a diagnosis, and there's a diagnosis called reactive attachment disorder, and that's for people who have quite severe attachment difficulties. So it's not a diagnosis. We all have different attachment styles, but it's definitely a predisposition to kind of act in certain ways within relationships. And it's possible that children who've had behavioral difficulty have some sort of attachment process that's happening. It might not explain everything, but it might be one explanation as to why they're having behavioral concerns. I hope I answered that question. If at a stage parent shows aggressiveness in disciplining the child, and when the child grows up and the situation changes, the caregiver becomes balanced, what would be the impact on the child? Will the child still be remembering the way of disciplining? So let me just answer the aggressive one in a little way. One of the things that has had a lot of research on is this idea of corporal discipline, which is smacking, which is hitting your kids when they've done something wrong. For some of you listening might think, oh, nobody does that anymore, do they? Or you might think, oh, a little bit is okay, they need to learn the lesson, a little bit of fear is all right. What we know from a public health, public policy kind of point of view is that smacking is actually one of the least effective parent management strategies, and in fact, in terms of impacting attachment styles and relationships, it's one of those things that is kind of the most damaging. Now, having said that, I don't want to talk in absolutes. Sometimes some parents do a little bit of smacking, but you might offset that with lots of loving relationships and things like that, and time where you're quite connected and things like that. What we know is for some people who have had difficulties is that, often the more you're struggling as a parent, the more you're going to rely on really harsh and punitive kind of limit setting with children. Why do you rely on that? Because it's very effective in stopping behavior. When you hit a child, when you yell at them, they will stop. Most of the time, they will stop doing it at the start. So short-term gains is almost guaranteed. But what we know about fear, about anxiety, on the long term is that fear is a very poor teacher. So one of the things when people come in and their child's misbehaving, common wisdom would say they just need to be more strict. They need to tell them, stop it. You need to stop doing that, be more strict. But what you start to actually see is that when people actually come to people like me and ask for help, you realize that the problem is not that they're not setting limits. Sometimes it is. The problem more is about how they're setting limits, and that the fact that they've used too much of that kind of punishment and aggressiveness. So they've done too much of that, and now we're kind of facing the repercussions of that, which is that's no longer effective, and they don't know what else to be able to do. How can they kind of go back to the secure attachment when all they've been able to do is, dole out the punishments like that? So, I think that's important to understand when it comes to kind of smacking things like that. The other kind of important process to understand is this idea of rupture and repair. So when your child or you get angry, no parent's perfect. I've got really bad days when I've had a long day in the office, or my wife's not in a good mood or whatever. Sometimes we'll yell at our daughter. So we're not perfect, but and there might be ruptures sometimes where you might think to yourself, I shouldn't have done that, or you think, oh, I need to calm down or whatever. So there's some sort of rupture there, but there's always the opportunity for repair. And one of the things we know most powerfully with children is that they're extraordinarily forgiving of their parents, especially young children. And so even if you feel like you've made a mistake, you always have the opportunity to repair, to make your relationship secure in one way or the other. Children are so forgiving that in the jobs I've done where the parents have actually been abusive and really treated them poorly, really hit them, not provided for them, even in those circumstances, the children have a huge place in their kind of heart, in their relationship, for forgiveness and love and connection. They might not like them, they might get angry, but they always have that space for connection and forgiveness. And that's a really important thing to remember. So if things have happened in the past, unless they were really traumatic, really frightening, and it's impacting them now when they're thinking about it and having specific symptoms, if that's not happening, it's most likely that there's been some level of repair and rupture that's happened. I'll keep going because I'm just aware of the time, but thank you for the questions. I think it kind of links into a lot of the kind of important points I was hoping to make. So this is just a quick summary. So of course with secure, you're feeling loved. These are some of the messages and beliefs that often people travel with. I think Gary sent around a questionnaire, so you might have different opinions about yourself, about which kind of style of attachment you are. Avoidant, of course, I feel detached and indifferent. ambivalent, they often are left feeling misunderstood, right? Because there isn't a consistent sort of presence there that can kind of meet their needs. And then, of course, disorganized, I feel frightened and worried all the time. So these are some of the kind of behaviors and outcomes that we see with the different attachment styles. So the important thing to remember is that attachment styles are not just in little children. We all have attachment styles across time. And what we also know is that our attachment styles differ from the situations that we're in. So what we know is for people who are disorganized, depending on the situation, they might present as being insecure, ambivalent, or they might present as being avoidant from different points of time. So let's say, for example, and people who are avoidant might be secure as well at different points of time. So let's say, for example, you are in a relationship with someone. Everyone might remember if you're in a relationship at this point, good for you, enjoy it. But we all have memories of that, where the other person is the best person in the world. You can feel like you can trust them with everything. It's the person you are meant to be all the time, all your life. And then sometimes things don't kind of work out, and then when they don't work out, we might find that the person isn't coming out and socializing anymore. They're at home a lot. They're not taking our calls. They become avoidant. So the person might have a secure attachment style more generally, but when they're confronted with loss and pain and hurt, they might engage in behaviors that are avoidant. Some people might kind of avoid everybody. Other people might get more irritable and cranky, and they might be more touchy in relationships, and we think, oh God, what do I say, that kind of thing. So what we know is that people can move between these, but what we do know is, of course, that disorganized people have a much harder time going to moving into being secure. They often end up being ambivalent or avoidant, and they have a harder time building these secure attachments. So it's dynamic, it changes across time, but there's also a stable pattern over time as well. So don't ever jump to any conclusions about what you might have. So a couple of things I'll say, I'm just aware of the time as well, that, this idea of how your kind of attachment changes over time, it's an important way to think about how we get our needs met within relationships. And one of the things, this image is from a book that Kai and I have written about incorporating some of these sort of attachment-oriented theories into classroom practice, so within school. So you have these children who have disorganized attachments, have had traumatic things happen to them. They go to school, and that's where they spend most of their time, actually, a lot of the time. And that school is often where they feel the safest. Home is not where they feel safe. School is where they feel safest. And so one of the things that people are getting very smart about is, even though we can't get these families into clinics and pediatricians or whatever, we can intervene at school, because the children are often at school, and we can pull parents in, and we can use that as a platform to be able to kind of offer good support. But what we do know, of course, is that for those disorganized children with insecure attachments, they have some of the poorest educational outcomes. And not only do they have insecure attachments, they're more likely to come from like a minority background, from intersectional background, so they have multiple levels of disadvantage. And so we need to find another way in which we can get smarter about supporting these kids. If we can keep them at school for a few more years, the education's really going to change their trajectory. If we can provide them with safe relationships at school, that's going to make a really big difference for them across time. And so it's really about helping people not just see behavior and think, oh, this child is being naughty, they're doing this on purpose, they're trying to get attention, to actually really think more deeply about, what is this child trying to get? How are they trying to get proximity? How are they trying to get their needs met from the people around them? Oh, I'll just skip over that slide. I won't go through all of this, but I think it's really useful to think about this idea of safety. So some of you who are professionals here, who might be confronted with different forms of attachment all the time. Some of you might be educators, some of you might have colleagues who have different kind of attachment style. It's useful to kind of just think of these sort of 4 rules. The first one is being present. So if for people who have disorganized attachments, just the fact that you're there, all relationships feel frightening and triggering. So the fact that you can just even be present, physically present, you don't have to talk, you don't have to say anything, just being consistently physically present often offers that first step into them slowly starting to trust you and believe that you'll be someone who will be consistently there. And so, this idea that, I can see you, I acknowledge you, and I'm not going to get any closer because I know that's frightening for you, but I'm going to be here. And this idea of physical presence is incredibly important. One of the things we are really trying to do here is really advocate for mums and families to really be present with their infants, not send them off to daycare too early, not to have long periods of separation, to really be physically present, because that physical presence makes an extraordinary difference in people's life. And that's something I know I tell myself, to get home from work and just be physically present at home is an incredibly powerful message and sort of influence and attachment. Second one is listen. And we've come a long way. We used to say, be seen, not heard with children. You want to see them, you don't want to hear about their problems. Of course, what we know now is that, listening to children is incredibly important. They often have complex lives, emotional lives and problems. And so listening and attending to what they're saying is really important. And quite frankly, it's one of the real joys of being a parent, really, is being able to listen to what they're saying to you. But with smartphones, with competing priorities, it's very, very easy to go a whole week with just being around people and not having a meaningful conversation. And that can be hard, knowing what to ask and what to ask so that they tell you what's going on. That in itself is a tricky thing. Reflect. So reflect often it refers to what we call reflective listening, which is a set of sort of skills. So it's not just enough for you to listen and understand. The other person needs to know that you're listening as well. They need to know that they are being understood. And this is very, very important. The way children see themselves is through your eyes first. If you love them and you think they're capable, that is how they will come to see themselves. You are their mirror. It's not just mirror neurons. It's quite literally the beliefs that you're carrying. So when you reflect that, when you communicate that, how you feel about them is how children come to feel about themselves. So that's incredibly important. And the last thing is validation. And what we mean by validation is that the child, that the person you are with has value, is lovable, no matter what they achieve or what they do. So for many of us, even if we had the best parents, we're made to believe that our achievements, that are titles, that are material possessions, is what actually helps us, makes us lovable, makes us worthy. And that often kind of finds its roots in society, but also in those early relationships where there's conditional acceptance. If you do this, then I will love you. If you get good marks, then I would be proud of you. And so that kind of conditional, it's okay to have expectations of children, but when you start kind of communicating that conditional acceptance, that's where often things fall over, and that sort of secure attachment isn't communicated. And so one of the things I often say to kind of parents and people is that you can say, I don't like what you're doing, but I love who you are. So really separating the behavior from the person is an incredibly important way of offering validation. So So relationships are key. So they're very important, and I'll just end with this slide. I've gone 5 minutes over. I'm happy to stick around to take questions as well. So when we think about it from a very broad perspective, from a public health perspective, early relationships is a public health issue. We're saving an incredible amount of, healthcare expenditure. We're increasing productivity, not just for the individual, but across the community, across the country, if we make smart investments in early infant mental health and early childhood. And the three things we kind of work towards are supportive relationships, reducing sources of stress. And by sources of stress, I don't just mean psychological thing. I think very real things like material needs, support, financial support or material support. That's equally as important as emotional support. And also strengthening core skills. So cognitive skills, having stimulating environments that are not just about cognitive development. What we know about brain development is that we learn in different ways. Education is not just about downloading information to the other person. It's about doing it within a relationship, using your body, using your mind, and having an integrated experience. And when we do that, we have healthy, emotionally and mentally healthy children who end up being responsive and productive members of our community. So I'll leave you with that sort of message. This is our book. Like Smitha was saying, that's freely available. You can just follow that link, and if you want to purchase it, you can just hop onto our website or go to lulu.com. So TIPBS is our website. So we're trying to use some of these ideas within schools. So if you're working in schools or any healthcare kind of settings, please reach out to us, and I'm happy to talk to you further. And a few other resources that are very practical to read. And that's it. I'll just stop sharing. I don't know how I stop sharing there. I'm not quite sure how to stop sharing. Anyway, so I'll just leave it there. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for all the questions and the comments as well. We really sort of appreciate it. Thanks to Girish and the folks at Thunai as well. Like I said in the start, if you wanted to reach out to me, I'll just quickly whack my email address in the chat. Feel free to please email me. Any feedback you had from today or any other sort of connections you'd like to make for the future. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Govind. So we do have questions. Do you think you can take two of them?
Yeah, not a problem.
All right. So we have a question here which says that in clinical practice in pediatrics, how do you pick on avoidant or disorganized attachment? That's question number one. Yeah, I suggest we answer that first.
Yeah, not a problem. Yeah. So I guess the issue is around assessment, isn't it? So there's various ways in which we can assess attachment. So of course, one of the ways I would assess, so there's lots of ways to assess attachment. The question often becomes who assesses attachment. Often it's psychologists like me, often pediatricians are quite busy a lot of the time, so kind of medical practitioners, and we use kind of a multimodal assessment. So we do a clinical interview. So we get a little bit of a history of what those early years were like. So we talk to mom or dad. We also get some history about what led to the pregnancy and that sort of thing. And that often flags with us some risk factors in the family, in the parent, but also within the child that might point to a certain type of attachment. What we also do is a observational assessment. So we watch the child and the parent together. And what I often have is some structured tasks and things like that they need to complete, kind of like the strange situation that we watched before. So we observe how the parent is interacting with the child, how the child is playing, what the quality of that is as well. And the third kind of prong thing that we do is questionnaires. So we have adult measures of attachment, and we also have measures of kind of relationships that are filled out by the parents about the child, but also we get collateral information from daycare or teachers or other kind of relevant family members. So what we do is we gather all of that information together to try and understand what the profile of the attachment style will be, and how that attachment fits in with the kind of concerns that the parents are coming in with at the time that people are actually seeking support for. And it's what we call, I guess, a conceptualization, that we kind of, put those pieces together, the attachment and all the other information together, to kind of paint a picture of why this is happening, but also what the attachment style might be that might be contributing to this. I hope that answered the question.
Right. So the next one asks any recommend assessments for clinicians. But probably you answered that one when you spoke about profiling and observation. But anything else that you want to add to this question?
Yeah, sure. So for adults, with parents, I do the adult attachment interviews, the AAI. That's something I do quite a lot. We do like an observational assessment. So the observational assessment, there are different types of kind of coding systems. I use a coding system called PCIT, so parent-child interaction treatment. So you're looking for parent-directed skills. You're also looking for child-directed kind of activities. So that's how we kind of code for those things, and PCIT has its own kind of coding system. I do a general developmental assessment as well, and an interview. So part of the parent interview, I use a reflective functioning structured interview. So where we ask them specific questions around how they do sense making, meaning making, mentalization of the child. But we also have specific questions about the parent's own childhood and their own attachment styles, and then their beliefs about parenting as well. I also use sort of general parenting measures around how they might do limit setting or do positive reinforcements and things like that as well. So that's a few different measures that you can kind of use to ascertain that.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Govind. I have a question of my own just to end this. So you mentioned that don't use the word "don't cry," don't do this, but then what's the alternative to that?
Is this when you're being dismissive of them?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Look, it's so funny, isn't it, giving parenting advice? Because one of the things I've sort of realized is different people need to hear different things, and then you need to do different things in different contexts as well. What I would leave you with is, so often in daily life, we are so reactive. We act before we think. And to be honest, you can't stop and think about everything. Some things just need to happen. But when it comes to relationship, there is a lot of value in being reflective. And when I say reflective, it's a very fancy way of saying stop, think, and then do. Think about, what's happened. Think about what it means to you. Think about what it means to this other person, and act in a way that is going to be most useful and productive for the both of you. And when you take, and often, most of the time, we don't have to be reactive. We actually have more time to react to things than we realize. So taking the time to think about it. And I think when we take the time to think about it, we realize that the most useful and productive thing to do is to offer a compassionate response to whoever is in front of us. Attempt to understand before being understood. Attempt to be compassionate. We could all be saints and self-actualized and be like that all the time, but that's not real life, and that's not helpful for kids. But as much as you can, I think being thoughtful and reflective is probably going to serve you well with your children, but also in relationships in general, I think.
Thank you so much, Dr. Govind. It Yeah, that's right. I agree with what you're saying. So many instances today where I went, wow, I'm doing it fine. So many instances where I said, oh my God, I should have done it better. I'm sure most of us thought and felt that way. And it has been an amazing 90 minutes with you. Thank you so much for being here. So I have put in your details on the chat. Just for everybody else who's still here, you can reach out to us on www.thunai.org, and you can get access to more such information and newsletters. We have Dr. Govind's information there and his website as well. So you can reach out to him with your questions if need be. And he's been very kind to accept to answer them. So thank you for that again.
No, not a problem. And thank you for these. And thanks everyone who hung around and listen. I'm happy to hang around for another 5 or 10 minutes if people had any specific questions. But yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Anybody else with any questions? So there are a lot of thank yous coming in. If anybody else has a specific question. All right. Okay, which means that we can bring this to a wrap, and it's 11 o'clock for you. Time to say good night. All right, everybody, have a good night, a good weekend, and a great Deepavali. Dr. Govind, wish you a great Deepavali from Team Thunai. And see you all soon in our next webinar, which is early in the month of December. Thank you so much.